My daughter thought she was leaving me at the mercy of the storm. But I have studied storms my whole life, and I know that the most dangerous ones are not those that bring snow, but those that rage in human hearts. She didn't know that after giving all my savings for her house, I had kept something more valuable for myself: knowledge. She saw only a burden in me, but soon the whole city will see a profit in me. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Samuel, and I was 72 years old. My world had contracted to the dimensions of a single room, a space that the architect had likely intended as a home office or a nursery. For me, it was a meteorological station, a library, and a sanctuary. I woke, as I always did, before the sun, prompted by a biological clock calibrated by a lifetime of early morning observations. The first thing I did, before my feet even touched the floor, was look at the barometer on the wall opposite my bed. It was an old, beautiful instrument, a gift from my university colleagues upon my retirement, with a polished brass casing and a delicate, determined needle. That morning, the needle was in a deep, steady dive. A significant pressure drop. A storm was not just coming, it was imminent. The room itself was an anachronism within the larger structure of my daughter Claire's house. While her world, the world beyond my closed door, was all cool grays, sharp angles, and minimalist decor, my room was a haven of aged wood, yellowed paper, and the warm gleam of brass. Bookshelves, which I had assembled myself with quiet, careful hands, overflowed with the companions of my life. The glossary of meteorology, worn paperback editions of Lorenz and Charney, and thick climatology textbooks with my own annotations filling the margins. The centerpiece of the room, my workspace, was a large drafting table tilted at a permanent angle. On it, a fresh sheet of paper was always waiting. My life as a meteorologist had not ended with retirement. It had simply become more personal, a conversation between me and the sky. My morning ritual was unchanging. After checking the instruments, I would step out onto the small balcony attached to my room, the only part of the outdoors that felt truly mine, and take in the sky. The house was in a suburb of Denver, and the view to the west was a breathtaking, jagged line of the Rocky Mountains. They were my true barometer. I could see the lenticular clouds beginning to form over the peaks, the telltale sign of mountain wave turbulence, a clear precursor to a significant weather event. The air was still but carried a certain weight, a pregnant pause before the first act. I would record my observations: temperature, humidity from the hygrometer, wind speed and direction from the small anemometer I had mounted on the railing, in a leather-bound logbook. Then came the part of the day that brought me the most peace: drawing the map. With a fine leaded pencil, I would sketch the isobars, the delicate curving lines that depicted areas of equal pressure. It was a form of calligraphy, a language I understood intimately. I would shade in the low-pressure system moving in from the northwest, a swirling vortex of energy that I could almost feel in my bones. Once the map was complete, my solitary duties were done, and the challenge of navigating the human climate of the house began. I would wait until I heard the front door close, signaling that Claire's husband, Mike, had left for his office, and the sound of the television in the living room told me the children were occupied. Only then would I venture out to the kitchen. I moved through their house like a ghost, my soft-soled slippers making no sound on the polished hardwood floors. The kitchen was a sterile, white space, beautiful and cold, like an Arctic landscape. I would make a simple cup of instant coffee, careful to wipe away any stray grounds, and retreat back to my room before my presence could become an inconvenience. The tension in the house was a palpable thing, a high-pressure system of its own. Claire, my daughter, moved with a brisk, efficient energy, that always seemed to carry a charge of impatience. She loved me, I believed, in an abstract, dutiful way, but my physical presence in her home was a complication she had not anticipated in her carefully planned life. She would bring my clean laundry, fold it into a neat, impersonal stack, and place it just inside my doorway, rarely stepping fully into my world of maps and books. Her sighs were her primary form of communication with me, a quiet exhalation that spoke of burdens and unspoken frustrations. Mike was a simpler weather system to read, cold and clear. He was a successful financial advisor who saw me, I was sure, as a non-performing asset, a liability on the family's emotional balance sheet. He rarely acknowledged me, his gaze sliding past me in the hallway as if I were a piece of furniture he didn't particularly care for. Their combined presence created a domestic climate of chilly, persistent overcast, a stark contrast to the dramatic, honest fury of the approaching storm outside. I found I much preferred the storm. The atmosphere, at least, was honest about its intentions. So I stayed in my room, my sanctuary, and watched the sky, finding comfort in the predictable physics of the air and the grand, impersonal beauty of the clouds. A world that made perfect, logical sense in a house that made none at all. The storm arrived precisely when my charts had predicted it would. The first sign was not the snow, but the sound. The wind, which had been a low whisper all morning, began to keen, a high, mournful sound that vibrated through the window panes of my small room. The sky, a vast canvas I studied with a scholar's devotion, transformed from a benign, hazy gray into a bruised, turbulent mass of leaden clouds. Then came the first flakes. They were not the gentle drifting flakes of a picturesque snowfall. They were small, hard, and driven almost horizontally by the rising gale. I stood on my small balcony, the icy wind whipping at my coat, and felt a familiar academic thrill. It was a classic Colorado Clipper, a fast-moving, low-pressure system sweeping down from the north, a beautiful and powerful engine of atmospheric physics. I watched its arrival not with apprehension, but with the deep, quiet respect of a lifelong student witnessing a master at work. Inside the house, a different kind of pressure system was building. The carefully maintained quiet of the morning was shattered. The children, unable to go outside, were a whirlwind of pent-up energy, their shouts and thuds echoing from the living room. Mike, my son-in-law, had been forced to work from home, and the house was now filled with the sound of his loud, aggressive voice on a series of conference calls, his words sharp with the jargon of finance and risk. The house seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, the air growing thick with a shared, unspoken claustrophobia. The storm outside was a force of nature, vast and impersonal. The storm inside was small, human, and aimed directly at me. The knock on my door came in the mid-afternoon, just as the snow had become a blinding white curtain, erasing the world beyond my window. It was not Claire's usual quick, almost perfunctory rap that announced the arrival of fresh laundry. This knock was different, softer, more hesitant, yet somehow more determined. I turned from my drafting table as the door opened. She stood there, framed in the doorway, holding a sleek tablet. She was dressed in a sharp blazer, her professional armor, her face a carefully composed mask of concern. It was a look I had come to recognize, the one she wore when she had to deliver unwelcome, but in her mind, necessary news. She did not step fully into the room, but lingered on the threshold, her eyes scanning the space not as a daughter visiting her father's sanctuary, but as a project manager assessing a work site. Her gaze slid over my hand-drawn maps and my brass instruments without a flicker of interest. They were merely clutter in a space she was about to repurpose. She began her silent presentation. With a series of short, efficient gestures, she indicated the area where my reading chair and lamp stood, then sketched a rectangle in the air, the shape of a desk. She held up the tablet, the screen glowing. On it was a brightly colored web page for what was called the Northwood Community Winter Center. There were pictures of smiling volunteers, clean cots, and steaming mugs of soup. The text was full of cheerful, hollow words like shelter, warmth, and community. It was a masterpiece of public relations, designed to make a homeless shelter look like a cozy, temporary retreat. She looked from the tablet to me, her eyebrows raised in an expression of gentle, reasonable inquiry. It was a performance of the highest caliber. I watched her, my face impassive, and I analyzed the human weather in front of me. The forced, sympathetic smile was a high-pressure ridge of civility, but her eyes were a cold front, clear and arctic, moving in with an unstoppable force. She saw the lack of response on my face and moved to her final, irrefutable point. She pointed a finger first at the swirling, violent snowstorm outside the window, a maelstrom of white chaos. Then she tapped her watch, a gesture of urgency. Finally, her finger swept around my room again. The connection she was forging was clear and utterly false. The storm was an emergency. Time was of the essence, and my room was the only logical solution to a temporary problem. The storm was not the reason for this decision. It was merely the opportunity, the perfect, blameless cover for an action she had likely wanted to take for months. In her mind, she was not abandoning her father. She was making a sensible, short-term logistical choice in the face of a crisis. It was a clean, elegant, and devastating lie. I felt the full weight of the betrayal settle on me, not as a hot, raging fire, but as a block of ice forming in my chest. I thought of the savings I had given her, the money that had formed the down payment on this very house, this room. My past generosity had purchased my present exile. I understood in that moment that any argument was futile. To show her my rising barometer, to explain the science of the Chinook winds that I knew would follow this storm, bringing a rapid thaw, would be pointless. She was not dealing in facts. She was dealing in justification. To resist would be to make her the villain, a role she was not prepared to play. She needed me to be a willing, or at least a passive, participant in her narrative of necessity. And so, I gave her what she needed. I looked from her earnest, pleading face to the beautiful, raging storm outside. Then I turned my gaze back to her and gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was not a gesture of agreement, but of surrender. A wave of visible relief washed over her face. The tension left her shoulders, and her manufactured smile became, for a second, almost genuine. The transaction was complete. She had secured my compliance, and with it, her own clear conscience. She gave a brisk, satisfied nod in return, turned, and closed the door, leaving me alone in the quiet of my room, the sound of the wind now a lonely, mournful cry. The click of the door closing behind her was a sound of immense finality. It was not a slam, but a soft, decisive latching that seemed to suck the air and the warmth from my small room. I remained seated at my drafting table, my hand still holding the pencil I had been using to shade a pressure gradient. In the wake of her departure, a profound silence descended, a silence that was heavier and more suffocating than the muffled quiet of the snowstorm raging outside. My sanctuary, the one place I had felt a sense of order and purpose, had been breached and irrevocably altered. It was no longer a study. It was a holding cell. The call had been made, a call for my surrender, my removal, my erasure. And in that ringing silence, I made my choice. I refused. My refusal was not a shout, not a slammed door, not a frantic plea. It was as quiet and as powerful as a change in barometric pressure. It was an internal, silent, and absolute rejection of the fiction she had presented. My eyes drifted from the door, which still seemed to hold the cold energy of her presence, to the instruments that had been my life's true and honest companions. The needle on my beautiful brass barometer had not wavered from its steady, upward climb. Outside, The wind still howled, but its pitch had changed, a subtle shift in frequency that my experienced ear could easily detect. The peak of the storm's ferocity had already passed. Her narrative of an escalating multi-day crisis, the very foundation of her compassionate-sounding eviction, was a lie. My instruments, the unbiased arbiters of atmospheric fact, told me so. And I, in the quiet dignity of my own mind, chose to believe the truth of the physical world over the convenient falsehoods of my own daughter. I could have argued. The thought flickered through my mind, like heat lightning. I could have taken her by the hand, led her to my charts, and explained the science in calm, rational terms. I could have pointed to the rising pressure, the shifting wind patterns, the inevitable influx of warmer air from the south that always followed a clipper of this type. I could have shown her my own forecast, neatly logged, predicting a thaw to begin within 24 hours. But I had looked into her eyes. There I had seen a weather system far more complex and dangerous than any blizzard. I saw not a daughter seeking a solution, but a stranger executing a decision that had been made long before the first snowflake fell. To argue with her would have been as pointless as trying to reason with a tornado. Her mind was a closed front, impervious to any data that contradicted her desired outcome. And so my refusal took the form of silence. I would not participate in her drama. I would not give her the satisfaction of a fight, a scene that would have allowed her to cast herself as the long-suffering daughter, dealing with a difficult father. I refused her the conflict she may have subconsciously needed to fully justify her actions. My silence was my shield. My refusal also had to be an act of preservation. I would not allow this moment to break me. I rose from my chair, my movements slow and deliberate, and went to the small closet where an old duffel bag was stored. The act of packing was not a scramble of defeat. It was a methodical, curated selection of my identity. I did not reach for sentimental objects or extra sweaters. I reached for the things that defined me. First, my leather-bound logbook, its pages filled with decades of observations in my neat, precise script. Then, a small velvet-lined case containing my pocket barometer and a compass. I chose 3 specific pencils, sharpened to perfect points, and a well-worn copy of Kendrew's Climates of the Continents. My children saw me as an old man, a burden. But these objects were a reminder of who I truly was, a scientist, an observer, a man of empirical truths. They were the essential tools of my trade, and of my soul. I zipped the bag, its contents meager but essential. I was being displaced, but I refused to be erased. I took one last look around the room, at the shelves overflowing with books, the large hand-drawn maps tacked to the walls, the array of brass and glass instruments that had measured out the days of my quiet life. A deep, sorrowful ache bloomed in my chest, a grief for the loss of this place, this last bastion of my former self. But then, my gaze fell on my own reflection in the dark window pane, and I saw not a frail, defeated old man, but simply an observer. The knowledge from all these books, the experience of a lifetime of forecasting, was not in the paper or the brass. It was behind my eyes. That was the one thing she could not take from me, the one thing that could not be packed away or left behind. Before I sat down to wait, I stepped out onto the balcony one final time. The wind was noticeably calmer. The snow was lighter now, softer. I took a deep breath of the cold, clean air, and I could feel the truth of my forecast in the very marrow of my bones. The great thaw was coming. The scientific certainty of it was a solid, unshakable rock in the turbulent ocean of my circumstances. Her lie was a temporary, man-made phenomenon. The truth of the atmosphere was elemental and enduring. I stepped back inside, closed the door, and sat in my reading chair, my small duffel bag at my feet. I had refused the call to despair, refused the call to fight, refused the call to believe in a reality that was not my own. I was simply waiting, a calm observer at the center of a storm, armed with a secret knowledge that was my own quiet, defiant answer. I sat in my chair and waited. My small duffel bag, containing the carefully selected remnants of my identity, rested by my feet. The house had fallen into a strange, anticipatory quiet. The storm outside raged on, a constant swirling barrage of white against the window pane, but inside, the usual domestic sounds had ceased. There was no television, no sound of Mike's voice on the phone. There was only the low hum of the furnace and the occasional creak of the house settling under the weight of the new snow. It was the kind of charged silence that precedes a departure, a pocket of stillness before a significant event. I heard the soft tread of her footsteps in the hallway, a sound I could distinguish from any other. The doorknob turned. Claire stood there, already wearing her heavy winter coat, her car keys jingling softly in her hand. Her face was set in the same expression of strained, dutiful concern. She did not offer to take my bag. She simply waited for me to rise and follow. The walk from my room to the front door was the longest journey of my life. I moved through the spaces that had, for the past few years, been the landscape of my constrained existence. We passed the living room, where my grandchildren were sitting on the floor, their eyes glued to the bright, flashing screen of a video game, utterly oblivious to the quiet, momentous drama unfolding behind them. On the wall hung a large, professionally taken family portrait. All of them, Claire, Mike, the children, were smiling, a perfect image of suburban contentment. I was not in the picture. It was a detail I had noted when they first hung it, a small but clear signal of my place in this family. An outlier, a temporary resident in a life that was not my own. I looked at the photograph as I passed, and it felt like it was from a different century, a different world. In the car, the silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, hypnotic thump of the windshield wipers battling against the relentless snow. The world beyond the windows was a formless, white blur, the familiar landmarks of our town erased by the storm. The car was a small, warm, sealed capsule of tension, moving through a landscape of chaos. Claire gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. Her gaze was fixed intensely on the road ahead, her focus on the act of driving a convenient and necessary shield. She was navigating a blizzard, and her concentration was a performance of maternal responsibility, a justification for the difficult but necessary thing she was doing. I knew this performance well. It was the same focused look she had when tackling a difficult project at work or managing a family crisis. It was the look of a person in control. I, in turn, did not look at her. I turned my head and watched the world dissolve into whiteness. I was not afraid. I felt a strange and profound sense of detachment, as if I were observing a complex weather phenomenon from a great distance. I watched the way the wind sculpted the snow into drifts against fences and trees, the physics of it as beautiful and predictable as ever. While Claire was battling the storm, I was simply observing it. And in my chest, I held the secret knowledge I had confirmed from my balcony just an hour before. The pressure was rising. The wind was already beginning to shift. The thaw was coming. This secret was a small, warm, and solid thing in a world that had become cold and uncertain. Her entire justification was based on the premise of a prolonged, dangerous storm. My entire strength was based on the quiet, empirical certainty that she was wrong. We finally pulled up to a large institutional brick building, its corners softened by accumulating snow. A simple functional sign near the entrance read, City of Denver Municipal Shelter. There were no smiling volunteers on the webpage, no steaming mugs of soup. There was only the bleak, utilitarian reality of a place of last resort. The engine idled for a moment, the wipers continuing their relentless work. Then she turned it off, and the silence rushed back in, heavier than before. We got out of the car, and the cold was a physical shock, the wind tearing at my clothes and stinging my exposed face. She walked me to the curb, a perfunctory guiding hand on my elbow. She leaned in, and I felt the brief, cold press of her lips against my cheek. The kiss was as fleeting and insubstantial as a single snowflake. I watched her mouth form the words, her breath pluming in the frigid air, the lie about the roads clearing in a couple of days, a soft, almost inaudible sound against the howling of the wind. I saw in her eyes not conviction, but a desperate, willed belief in her own fiction. She did not wait to see me go inside. She turned quickly, her escape from the moment swift and final. I watched as she got back into the car, the red of her taillights a brief, bloody smear against the white canvas of the storm. Then they too were gone, swallowed by the swirling snow. I stood alone, the duffel bag in my hand, a pathetically small anchor in the vast, indifferent storm. The snow began to collect on the shoulders of my old wool coat. I felt the full, crushing weight of my solitude, the stark reality of my abandonment. I had crossed the threshold. And then, as the wind tore at me and the cold began to seep into my bones, a slow, faint smile touched my lips. It was not a smile of happiness. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated irony. It was the smile of a man who held a single, powerful, and undeniable truth. She thought she had left me at the mercy of the storm, but I knew its secrets. I knew it was already dying, and I knew the thaw was coming. With that knowledge as my only warmth, I turned and walked toward the unforgiving doors of my new home. The heavy doors of the shelter closed behind me, shutting out the sound of the wind and sealing me into a new, dissonant world. The first test was the air itself. It was a thick, layered atmosphere, a complex front of conflicting scents, the sharp, sterile bite of industrial disinfectant, the cloying sweetness of institutional soup, the damp wool of 100 wet coats, and underneath it all, the sad human smell of unwashed bodies and lingering despair. The next test was the sound. It was not a place of quiet refuge, but a cacophony of human misery, a chorus of hacking coughs, the low, constant murmur of dozens of private conversations, the sudden angry shout from a far corner, and the relentless, cheerful blare of a television mounted high on the wall, broadcasting a game show to an audience that had lost everything. I was guided by a tired-looking man to an intake desk, a simple folding table that served as the border crossing into this new country. I was handed a clipboard with a form, my life to be condensed into a series of impersonal boxes: name, age, last known address. I filled it out, my hand steady, my script neat. I was no longer Samuel, the retired meteorologist, the homeowner, the father. I was a name on a list, a temporary case file. I was handed a thin gray blanket, a towel worn almost to transparency, and a cot assignment, number 73. This was the first great stripping away, the methodical erosion of identity that was the price of admission. The primary enemy here was not a person, but the system itself, a bureaucracy designed for efficiency, not dignity. I found my cot in a vast, cavernous room that might have once been a gymnasium. It was filled with a sea of identical metal-framed beds, arranged in brutally straight lines under the unforgiving glare of long fluorescent lights that hummed with a constant, weary buzz. This was the main theater of my new life. I placed my duffel bag at the foot of the thin mattress and sat down, my back straight, and I began to do the only thing I knew how to do. I observed. I did not see a crowd of homeless people. I saw a complex social ecosystem, a human weather map of immense and fascinating complexity. I began to analyze the patterns. There was a man near the television who was a localized thunderstorm, loud, blustery, and prone to sudden violent outbursts over which he had no control. In a far corner, A woman sat wrapped in a cocoon of blankets, a fog bank of pure, motionless despair. There were small, tight groups of 2 or 3 who had clearly formed alliances, stable high-pressure systems of mutual protection, deflecting any newcomers. The overall atmospheric condition of the room was a deep, stagnant trough of low pressure, a place where hope came to die. To see it this way, as a series of interlocking systems, was not an act of coldness. It was my only defense. It was how I could observe the horror of it all without being consumed by it. Later, a line formed for dinner. I took my place, my metal tray in hand. The server was a young woman, perhaps a university student, her face etched with a fatigue that went beyond her years, but her eyes were clear and alert. She was the first potential ally I had seen. As I moved down the line, she ladled a thick, brownish stew into my bowl. As she did, her eyes met mine. For a fraction of a second, her practiced, neutral expression faltered. She saw something, perhaps the way I held myself, or the worn leather of the logbook that was tucked under my arm. Her gaze was not one of pity, which was a currency as common as despair in this place. It was a look of genuine, human curiosity. Without a word, her ladle dipped back into the pot, adding a little extra to my portion before she moved on to the next person. It was a tiny gesture, almost invisible, but in this landscape of total anonymity, it was a flare of light, a sudden and unexpected break in the oppressive cloud cover. The greatest test came that night. The lights were dimmed but never fully extinguished, casting the vast room in a pale, ghostly twilight. Sleep was an impossibility. The darkness was alive with the sounds of 100 broken lives, the rasp of snoring, the wet, ragged coughs, the whimpering of a man in the grip of a nightmare, the quiet, open-eyed sobbing of another. The sheer, crushing weight of all this concentrated sorrow was a physical force. It pressed down on me, threatening to pull me under into its hopeless depths. This was the true enemy, the temptation to give in, to accept this as my final reality, to let the cold seep into my soul. I closed my eyes, but I did not think of my daughter. I did not think of my old life. I forced my mind outward, beyond the walls of this building, into the sky. I visualized the storm cell as it moved east, its energy dissipating over the plains. I pictured the isobars, the pressure gradients, the flow of the jet stream high above. I ran the calculations in my head, a complex and beautiful dance of physics and mathematics. I charted the inevitable arrival of the warm, downslope Chinook winds. The thaw was not a hope. It was a scientific certainty. I clung to this empirical truth as a man overboard clings to a piece of driftwood. It was real. It was logical. It could be trusted. I must have drifted into a shallow, fitful sleep, because I was awakened by a change in the light. A single clear ray of morning sun had found its way through a high, grimy window, cutting a sharp golden line through the dusty air of the dormitory. It was bright, clean, and unambiguous. I sat up. The thaw had begun. My forecast had been correct. A quiet, profound sense of validation settled over me. I was in a place designed to make me forget who I was, but I had held on. I reached into my bag, pulled out my logbook and a pencil, and in the first light of a new day, surrounded by the sleeping bodies of the lost, I made my morning entry, my hand steady, my purpose clear. The morning brought with it the undeniable proof of my forecast. The sunlight that streamed through the high, grimy windows was no longer the weak, watery light of a storm day, but a bright, sharp, and confident yellow. Outside, a new symphony had begun. The howling of the wind had been replaced by the soft, percussive dripping of melting snow from the eaves and the slushy hiss of the occasional car passing on the street. The great thaw had commenced, precisely on schedule. This external validation, this confirmation of physical law, was a private, internal victory, that fortified my spirit against the unchanging climate of the shelter. Here, inside these walls, the atmosphere remained the same, a stagnant, recirculating system of hopelessness and quiet despair. The thaw of the outside world had not penetrated this place. I knew then that I could not simply wait for my own personal weather to improve. A meteorologist does not command the weather, but he does understand the forces that move it. I had to find a force to move my own. My search for a tool, for a lever to exert some small influence on my fate, led me to the community board in the main hall. It was a chaotic collage of the city's forgotten needs, a testament to 1,000 minor struggles. The board was a messy, layered thing: faded flyers for free legal aid, notices about missing pets, job postings for dishwashers and day laborers, and official jargon-filled memoranda from the Department of Human Services. I read through it all with the methodical patience of a researcher studying sediment layers, each piece of paper a different era of need. My initial scan was discouraging. The world represented on this board had no place for a 72-year-old academic. My skills were not in lifting boxes or scrubbing floors. They were in deciphering the elegant, invisible dance of the atmosphere. I was an expert in a field that had no value here. It was then that I saw it, tucked in a corner, partially obscured by a flyer for a flu shot clinic. It was a small, unassuming clipping from the local newspaper, the text printed in a dense, compact font. My eyes, accustomed to scanning fine details on weather charts, focused on the words. A local television news station, Channel 8, was looking for unique stories related to the massive storm. They wanted to hear from people who had been affected in unusual ways, people with a unique perspective. The word perspective resonated with me. I was not just another victim of the storm. I had a perspective that was, I knew with absolute certainty, unique. The news channels, with their flashy graphics and breathless, sensationalist reporting, had all predicted a prolonged siege of snow. They had been wrong. I had been right. This small, forgotten news clipping was not a cry for help. It was an invitation. It was the entrance to the inmost cave. I did not act immediately. I retreated to my cot, the clipping carefully folded in my pocket. Purpose was a forgotten but welcome sensation. I took out my logbook and a pencil. This was not a time for a desperate plea. It was a time for a professional consultation. I began to structure my approach, my mind working with the old, familiar clarity it had when preparing a lecture. I would not begin with my personal predicament. The story was not about a homeless man. The story was about the science. I would present myself as a retired meteorologist who had accurately tracked and forecasted the storm and its subsequent rapid thaw using classical observational techniques. I would contrast my correct data-driven forecast with the incorrect computer model-driven hype of the major news outlets. My homelessness was not the hook. It was the compelling human backdrop to a story about knowledge, experience, and truth. I was not a victim seeking pity. I was an expert with valuable, proven information. The plan was formulated, but its execution required an accomplice. The shelter had a single telephone for residents' use, a battered payphone in the hallway that was a constant source of conflict and frustration. But I had seen another phone, a proper landline, on the desk in the main office. Access to it was the key. I needed my ally. I waited until the chaotic lunch period was over and a lull had settled over the shelter. I found the young woman from the night before, the one with the observant eyes, refilling paper towel dispensers. Her name tag read Anna. I approached her quietly, not with the shuffling gait of a defeated man, but with a direct and purposeful stride. I did not speak. I simply held out the small folded newspaper clipping for her to read. After she had read it, I looked at her, then tilted my head meaningfully toward the closed door of the office. It was a silent, direct request. a transaction based on the small, unspoken trust she had shown me the night before. I saw the hesitation in her eyes. I saw her glance at the list of shelter rules tacked to the wall, a long list of things residents were forbidden to do. I was asking her to break those rules, to risk a reprimand for a strange old man she barely knew. She looked from the rules, back to my face. I held her gaze, my expression calm, serious, and I hoped, conveying a sense of competence that belied my surroundings. Her internal debate lasted only a moment. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. She led me to the office, glancing down the hallway to ensure no one was watching, and pointed to the beige telephone on the corner of a cluttered desk. Then she turned and stood guard by the door, her back to me, granting me a moment of privacy and agency. The phone was an old, heavy thing, a relic from another era. I picked up the receiver, the plastic cool and solid in my hand. With a steady finger, I dialed the number from the newspaper clipping. As I listened to the sound of the phone ringing on the other end of the line, I felt a profound shift in my own internal climate. I was no longer a passive object being acted upon by the storm of my circumstances. I was now a force, however small, working to change the forecast. The thaw began not as an event, but as a subtle shift in the sensory landscape of the world. The first evidence was auditory. The profound, insulating silence that the deep snow had imposed upon the city began to dissolve. I was awakened by a sound I hadn't heard in days, the gentle, rhythmic dripping of water from the shelter's eaves. It was a soft, percussive music, a sound of release. Later, as the morning progressed, other sounds joined the chorus. The gurgle of a newly cleared drainpipe, the wet, abrasive hiss of tires rolling through slush on the nearby street. The world was waking up. The bright, unfiltered sunlight that poured through the high windows was no longer just a visual phenomenon. It carried a palpable warmth, a gentle thermal energy that promised a fundamental change in the state of things. Outside, the great white blanket that had paralyzed the city was in retreat, surrendering its form back to water, revealing the dirty, mundane truth of the asphalt and frozen earth beneath. Everything my science, my experience, my very bones had told me was coming to pass. My own ordeal, however, was just beginning. It was an ordeal of stillness, of waiting. I found a hard plastic chair near the shelter's main entrance, a vantage point that offered a clear view of the payphone on the wall, and the front doors through which any visitor, or any rescuer, would have to pass. I sat with my logbook in my lap, not to write, but as a comforting, familiar weight. My vigil was a silent, two-fronted observation. With one part of my mind, I tracked the progress of the thaw, noting the accelerating rate of melt, the specific quality of the sunlight, the slow rise of the temperature on a large, public thermometer across the street. With the other, more vulnerable part of my mind, I tracked the relentless, silent passage of time. The morning hours crawled by. The shelter hummed with its usual rhythm of managed despair, but my focus was entirely external. Every time the front door opened, letting in a blast of mild, damp air, my head would lift, my heart giving a small, traitorous lurch. But it was only ever a resident returning, or a delivery person, or a new admission with the same lost look I surely wore upon my own arrival. My daughter's car did not appear. The payphone on the wall remained stubbornly, brutally silent. At first, I allowed myself the luxury of rationalization. Perhaps the side streets were still treacherous. Perhaps the phone lines were down. I methodically constructed these small shelters of hope, and then, just as methodically, I dismantled them with cold, hard logic. I could see the traffic moving freely on the main road. The lights in the shelter were on, the television blaring. The power grid was fine. There was no physical reason, no meteorological impediment that could explain her silence. Midday came and went. Lunch was served, the same tasteless, lukewarm stew as the day before. I ate. not because I was hungry, but because the routine was an anchor. As the sun reached its apex, the last vestiges of my hope began to sublimate, turning from a solid thing into a vapor, and then into nothing at all. The full, unvarnished truth of my situation settled upon me not with a crash, but as a slow, cold, and heavy tide. Her lie had not been a temporary kindness designed to soften a short-term inconvenience. It had been a permanent solution. The storm was the excuse, but the exile was the intent. I was not waiting to be picked up. I was abandoned. The finality of that realization was a quiet, internal devastation, a deep, seismic shock that left no visible trace. I sat on my plastic chair, a statue of quiet obsolescence, a father whose daughter had thrown him away with the efficiency of clearing out an unwanted piece of furniture. This was the true ordeal, not the cold, not the hunger, not the indignity of the shelter, but the profound, absolute loneliness of being intentionally forgotten. It was in that moment of complete and utter desolation that the atmospheric conditions of my life finally shifted. The young woman, Anna, approached me, her stride quick and purposeful. She did not speak, but her eyes were bright with an urgent, excited energy. She pointed toward the front desk, then made a gesture that indicated a visitor. For me. A flicker of impossible hope ignited in my chest, a hope I immediately tried to extinguish. It could not be Claire, but it was someone. I rose slowly, my old joints protesting, and followed Anna's gaze. Standing near the entrance, looking profoundly out of place in the bleak institutional lobby, was a young woman I had never seen before. She was holding a reporter's notepad, and her sharp, intelligent eyes were scanning the room, searching. Anna led me to a slightly more private corner of the common room, a small alcove with two mismatched chairs. The young journalist introduced herself with a quick, professional nod. I simply inclined my head in return. This was it, the moment my plan, born of a desperate hope in the shelter's office, came to fruition. She began with a series of gentle, probing gestures, her pen poised, her expression a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. I did not offer her a story of personal tragedy. I did not speak of my daughter. I unzipped my duffel bag and took out my logbook. I opened it on the small table between us and turned the pages back to the days preceding the storm. I let her see the neat columns of data, the falling barometric pressure readings, the shifts in wind direction. I then showed her my hand-drawn charts, the swirling isobars of the approaching low-pressure system, and my final, written forecast, heavy snow for 12 to 14 hours, followed by a rapid, significant thaw caused by developing Chinook winds. I then simply pointed out the window, to the dripping eaves and the water running in the gutters, the undeniable physical proof of my words. I watched her face as she processed the information. I saw the professional skepticism in her eyes slowly dissolve, replaced by a dawning electric excitement. She looked from my meticulous old-world data to the world outside, and then back to me, a 72-year-old man in a homeless shelter who had, with a pencil and a barometer, outforecasted every major news station in the state. She began to write, her pen flying across the page in a furious scribble. The ordeal of my abandonment was absolute and unchanging, a new permanent feature of my emotional landscape. But in the midst of that profound, personal winter, the journalist's fervent scribbling was the first unmistakable sign of a coming spring. The young journalist's name, I saw from the press pass clipped to her jacket, was Catherine. She sat opposite me, her pen poised over a fresh page in her notepad, her expression a careful mixture of professional sympathy and keen-eyed skepticism. She was here for a story, a small colorful piece about the great storm, and I was, for the moment, a curiosity, a potential source of a poignant quote. I understood the transaction, but the reward I sought was not pity, and the story I had to offer was not the one she expected. I did not begin with my circumstances. I began with the science. I laid my leather-bound logbook on the small, wobbly table between us. I opened it to a page from the previous week and turned it so she could see. The page was a tapestry of my life's work in miniature. Neat columns of barometric pressure readings, humidity percentages, wind speed and direction, and detailed observations of cloud formations over the mountains. I then turned the page to my hand-drawn chart of the approaching low-pressure system. My finger, the nail clean but the knuckle swollen with age, traced the tightly packed isobars, a clear and dramatic illustration of the storm's intensity. Her eyes followed my finger, and I saw the first flicker of genuine intrigue. This was not the rambling of a confused old man. This was data, meticulously recorded. The reward began as a subtle shift in her posture. She leaned forward slightly, her professional distance closing by a few crucial inches. I then began my silent lecture. I could not speak the words, but I could show her the concepts. I used my hands, the tools of 1,000 classroom explanations, to demonstrate the phenomenon of the Chinook winds. One hand became the towering wall of the Rocky Mountains. The other, flat and open, became the mass of Pacific air moving eastward. I showed how the air was forced upward, cooling, losing its moisture as snow on the western slopes. Then came the crucial part, the descent. My hand swept down the leeward side of my mountain hand, a clear downward chop, demonstrating the rapid, compressive heating of the descending air. I pointed to my own calculations in the logbook, the formulas that predicted the exact temperature rise we were now experiencing. I watched her face as I performed my silent explanation. The initial look of polite interest transformed into one of genuine, focused concentration. She was no longer just seeing a story, she was seeing the science behind it. Her pen, which had been still, began to move, not just jotting down notes, but sketching a small diagram of what my hands were demonstrating. She was understanding. For the first time in years, someone was looking at me and seeing not a relic, not a burden, but a teacher. This was a form of intellectual validation so pure and so potent that it felt like drinking cool, clear water after days of thirst. My mind, which my own family had treated as a dusty attic full of useless old furniture, was being recognized as a place of value, of knowledge, of truth. She paused her writing and looked up from my logbook, her eyes finally meeting mine directly. The skepticism was gone. In its place was a look of dawning, profound respect. She understood the full scope of the story now. It was not about a homeless man caught in a storm. It was about an expert, a master of a dying observational art whose knowledge had been proven correct while the high-tech, computer-generated forecasts had failed. The irony, the sheer poetic injustice of my situation, was laid bare before her. This was the true reward. It was not a promise of rescue or a handful of money. It was the simple, invaluable gift of being seen. In a place designed to render me anonymous, I had been recognized. In a world that had deemed me irrelevant, my life's work had just been proven essential. Her next action confirmed the shift. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and made a quick, quiet call. A short while later, a man with a large, professional camera arrived. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his lens seeking out the details of the scene, a close-up of my hand-drawn charts, a shot of the worn spine of my logbook, and then a portrait of me. I did not smile. I simply looked into the camera, my expression calm, my posture straight. The flash went off, a sudden blinding burst of light that illuminated my corner of the shelter. In the brief, stark whiteness, the bleakness of my surroundings, the scuffed floor, the institutional green walls, the curious, hopeless faces of the other residents in the background, was thrown into sharp relief against the quiet dignity of my own focused expression. I was not being documented as a victim of poverty. I was being recorded as the central, improbable fact of a remarkable story. When they were done, Catherine packed her notepad and her pen. The photographer slung his camera over his shoulder. She looked at me one last time, and her professional demeanor was gone, replaced by a look of sincere, unvarnished admiration. She gave me a firm, decisive nod. It was not a nod of pity. It was a nod of promise, a silent assurance that my story would be told, and that it would be told correctly. Then they left, a small, efficient whirlwind of purpose that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. I remained in my plastic chair, the logbook still open on the table. The room was the same. The smell was the same. The sounds of despair were the same. My physical circumstances had not changed by a single inch, but I had been given a reward of immeasurable value. My knowledge had been seen, my identity had been restored, and my voice, silent for so long, was about to be heard. The journey back began not with a car ride, but with the flick of a switch on a television set. Evening had settled upon the shelter, bringing with it the familiar, dreary rhythm of another night. The dinner service was over, the metal trays had been clattered away, and the residents of this small, forgotten world had retreated into their private shells of quiet endurance. The large television in the common room, usually tuned to a mindless, blaring game show, was the digital hearth around which the lost souls of the city gathered, seeking not warmth, but simple distraction. I had positioned myself in a hard plastic chair with a clear view of the screen, my anticipation a quiet, tightly coiled spring in my chest. I knew the 6 o'clock news was about to begin. Across the room, I saw my ally, Anna, wiping down a table, but her eyes kept darting towards the clock on the wall. A silent, shared understanding passed between us. As the hour struck, Anna walked to the television and, with a quiet determination, changed the channel. A few groans of protest rose from the assembled residents, but they quickly subsided. The familiar, upbeat theme music of the Channel 8 Evening News filled the room. I watched the anchors shuffle their papers, their faces professional and polished, so far removed from the gritty reality of the room in which I was sitting. The first few segments were the usual fare: a local political dispute, a traffic report on the now cleared highways. My heart beat a slow, steady rhythm. I felt a profound sense of calm. I had launched my data into the world, a message in a bottle, and now I could only wait to see if it would be received. Then, it happened. The anchor turned to the camera, a serious expression on her face. A graphic appeared over her shoulder, a stylized snowflake with a question mark, and below it, the title, "The Weatherman of Cot 73. My face appeared on the screen, a still photograph taken just the day before. I was an old man in a threadbare sweater, my expression unsmiling and serious, but my eyes were clear. The common room, which had been a low hum of murmuring and coughing, fell silent. I could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the sudden collective intake of breath. One by one, heads turned from the screen to look at me, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and astonishment. I was no longer an anonymous fixture of their world. I was a headline. The story Catherine had crafted was a masterpiece of quiet power. It began with science. There were close-ups of my logbook, my neat script and hand-drawn charts filling the screen. An animator had even taken my simple sketch of the Chinook winds and brought it to life, showing the air flowing over the mountains and warming as it descended. My unspoken words, my silent lecture, had been given a clear and respectful voice. The report then juxtaposed this evidence of my expertise with stark, poignant footage of the shelter itself, the long rows of cots, the line for dinner, the bleakness of my new reality. They had told the story exactly as I had hoped. It was not a story about a poor, homeless man. It was a story about a rich, scientific mind in a poor and desperate place. It was a story about dignity. As the segment concluded with a final, long shot of me looking out the shelter window, the room remained utterly silent for a long moment. Then, a man a few cots down from me, a man who had never once made eye contact, slowly, deliberately, nodded his head at me. It was a small gesture, but it was a profound one. It was a nod of respect. I was no longer just Samuel. I was the weatherman. My story, my knowledge, had traveled out of this place of forgetting, and its first return was in the changed eyes of the very people who shared my predicament. That was only the beginning. The road back then became a literal, physical thing. The phone at the front desk, usually silent in the evenings, began to ring. Anna answered it, her face a mask of confusion that quickly turned to amazement. She answered another call, and another, and then the headlights of a car swept across the common room windows. An ordinary-looking man in a heavy coat got out, his arms laden with thick new blankets, which he carried to the front door. A few minutes later, another car pulled up, a woman emerging with 2 large cardboard boxes. I could smell the rich, warm scent of fresh pizza even from my chair. Then came another car, and another. A trickle of compassion had become a flood. My story, broadcast into the warm, comfortable living rooms of the city, had done its work. It had returned, not as an echo, but as a tangible wave of warmth and nourishment. The shelter, a place of stagnant, predictable despair, was transformed into a bustling hub of chaotic, hopeful activity. Anna and the other staff members were overwhelmed, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration as they directed the sudden, miraculous influx of donations. Food, clothing, money. The city was returning what had been lost. I walked to the window and watched as more cars lined up along the slushy curb, their headlights cutting bright paths through the darkness. The thaw I had predicted for the weather had manifested in the heart of my community. My knowledge, the only thing of value I had left, had been sent out into the world, and it had returned not for my benefit alone, but for everyone under this roof. Across the crowded, noisy room, Anna caught my eye. Her face was flushed, her hair a mess, and she gave me a wide, breathless, and beautiful smile. In that smile, I understood the true nature of my reward. The road back had not been a path to my old home, but a journey that had brought the compassion of an entire city to the doorstep of the forgotten. The morning after the broadcast, the shelter was a different world. The stagnant, low-pressure system of despair that had defined the space had been broken apart by a powerful incoming front of community goodwill. The large common room, once a quiet sea of lonely cots, was now a bustling port of activity. Volunteers, their faces bright with purpose, sorted through mountains of donated blankets and warm coats. The air, which had been thick with the scent of disinfectant, was now rich with the aroma of fresh coffee and pastries brought by a local bakery. There was a current of energy, of hope, that had been unimaginable just a day before. My own status within this new ecosystem had undergone a similar seismic shift. I was no longer an anonymous, invisible old man. I was the weatherman. Residents who had previously shuffled past me with downcast eyes now met my gaze with a nod of quiet respect. One man silently offered me the first, best donut from a newly opened box. Anna, my ally, moved through the chaos with a constant, weary smile, and whenever she passed me, she would give a small, proud shake of her head, as if in disbelief at the change I had wrought. I knew she would come, just as I could read the coming of a storm in the subtle shifts of the upper atmosphere. I could predict the trajectory of my daughter's pride and fear. The news story had not been an appeal for rescue. It had been a statement of fact, a quiet detonation of truth that I knew would send shockwaves through her carefully constructed world. I did not wait for her with anxiety or with hope. I waited with the calm, detached certainty of a scientist observing a predictable reaction. I found a relatively quiet corner, a chair near a pile of donated books, and sat, my logbook open on my lap. I was not hiding. I was simply choosing my ground, a small island of calm in the bustling, hopeful sea. Her arrival was heralded not by a car horn, but by a sudden hush that fell over the volunteers near the entrance. I looked up and saw her. She stood on the threshold of this new world, and she was utterly out of place. She wore an expensive camel hair coat, a stark contrast to the donated parkas being sorted nearby. Her face, which I had last seen composed in a mask of false sympathy, was now a chaotic storm of conflicting emotions. Pale with shock, flushed with a deep, burning humiliation, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate fear. She scanned the room, her gaze sweeping over the mountains of donations, the busy volunteers, the residents who were now being treated with a new level of dignity. This was not the bleak, desperate place she had left me in. This was a place of vibrant, undeniable community, a living testament to her own failure of compassion. Her eyes finally found me. I watched her cross the room, her stride uncertain on a floor she had never expected to walk on. She was a ship navigating a suddenly unfamiliar and treacherous sea. She stopped a few feet away from my chair, her hands twisting the strap of her leather handbag. She had come, I knew, with a single purpose: damage control. She had come to retrieve the inconvenient, embarrassing father, to bundle me away and restore the neat, orderly facade of her life. She had come expecting to find me broken, pathetic, a problem to be solved. She had come to rescue me, but the man she found was not the man she had abandoned. I did not rise to meet her. I simply looked up from my book, my expression calm, my posture relaxed. The power dynamic between us had been fundamentally, irrevocably inverted. Days ago, in my small room in her large house, she had held all the power. Here, in this crowded, chaotic shelter, I held it all. My resurrection was not a matter of my own feeling. It was a fact, reflected in the way the world now saw me, and in the way she was being forced to see me. She saw me not huddled on a cot, but sitting in a place of quiet honor. She saw the other residents looking at me with respect. She saw Anna give me a protective, proprietary glance from across the room. She was seeing not her dependent, elderly father, but the respected public figure the news had created. The wise, dignified man who had been cast out. The expert who had been right when everyone else was wrong. Her composure broke. Her face crumpled, and she took a half-step forward, one hand reaching out, a silent, desperate plea for me to come, to undo this, to make it all go away. The gesture was a demand for me to restore her world, to help her lie her way back to comfort. I looked at her outstretched hand, then back to her face, and I felt not anger, but a deep and sorrowful ache for the daughter I had lost, the woman whose fear and shame were so much more powerful than her love. Slowly, deliberately, I gave a single, almost imperceptible shake of my head. It was not a gesture of anger or of vengeance. It was a statement of fact, as simple and as final as a recorded barometric pressure. Then I lowered my gaze and turned a page in my book, returning my attention to the printed words, a quiet, definitive act of dismissal. I felt her recoil as if she had been struck. A wave of dark, crimson humiliation washed over her face. She was stranded, her plea rejected, her power gone, standing in the center of a room that was a public monument to her own private cruelty. For a long, silent moment, she stood frozen. Then she turned, not with the brisk efficiency I knew so well, but with a clumsy, hurried haste, a desperate flight. I watched her walk away, a stranger in a coat that had cost more than most people in this room possessed in the world. I watched the heavy doors swing shut behind her. The resurrection was complete. I had not been saved from this place. I had been reborn into it. I felt a gentle touch on my shoulder. It was Anna, holding out a steaming mug of coffee. I accepted it with a grateful nod, the warmth of it a small good thing in a world that was suddenly full of new and complex possibilities. Her departure left a vacuum in its wake, a pocket of still, silent air in the midst of the bustling, transformed shelter. I watched the main doors swing shut behind her, and with that final quiet motion, a chapter of my life, the long, quiet, and painful chapter of being a dependent in my daughter's home, was closed forever. I did not feel a surge of triumph or a bitter taste of victory. I felt only a profound and weary sense of finality, the quiet, aching calm that follows a storm's passage. The confrontation I had anticipated was over, and the outcome, though necessary, brought no joy. The elixir I had brought back into the world was not a potion of vengeance, but a simple, clarifying light of truth, and its beam had been as unforgiving to me as it had been to her, illuminating the full, heartbreaking extent of what our family had lost. I turned away from the door and took a slow, deliberate walk through the common room. This, I realized, was the tangible form of the elixir's return. The truth of my small, quiet story, amplified by a television signal, had returned to this place as a powerful, positive force. I saw it in the faces of the other residents, who were now eating a hot, nourishing meal of real food donated by a local restaurant, their expressions a little less haunted, a little more human. I saw it in the mountain of new, warm winter coats being sorted by smiling volunteers, a bulwark against the cold that awaited these people outside these walls. I saw it in a small child, the son of a young, desperate mother, now happily playing with a brand-new toy truck, his laughter a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy that had been absent from this place. My personal vindication had been transmuted into a communal blessing. My quiet act of self-preservation had brought a measure of comfort and dignity to dozens of others. I retreated to my cot, the one small space in this loud, public world that felt like mine, and sat on the edge of the thin mattress. It was here that the full cost of the elixir made itself known. The confrontation I had just endured was not with Claire, the frantic, humiliated woman in the expensive coat. The true confrontation was with myself, with the ghost of the daughter I had raised. My mind, unbidden, produced a memory from a lifetime ago, a clear autumn afternoon on a hillside, with a 5-year-old Claire sitting on my shoulders. I was pointing to the sky, explaining the difference between cumulus and cirrus clouds. I remembered the feeling of her small hands tangled in my hair, the sound of her delighted gasp as I described how clouds were made of tiny, floating drops of water. I remembered the absolute, uncomplicated trust in her eyes. I held that perfect, sunlit memory in my mind and set it beside the image of the frantic, cornered stranger who had just fled from my presence. The two images would not reconcile. The sweet, innocent child had somehow, over the years, metamorphosed into this woman, a person for whom dignity, honesty, and familial love were less important than the maintenance of a comfortable, untroubled life. The elixir of truth had not just exposed her lie. It had exposed the vast, sorrowful distance between the person she had been and the person she had become. The victory I had won felt hollow, an aching, empty space where a daughter's love had once been. I had won my freedom, but the price was the final, undeniable acknowledgement that the family I had cherished was gone. It was then that my refusal to return, which had been a simple, instinctual gesture in the moment of confrontation, solidified into a conscious and unshakable resolve. The elixir I had brought into the world was truth, and its first principle was that I could no longer live a lie. To return to her house, to that small, tolerated room, would be to once again accept the role of the invisible man, the quiet, shuffling burden. It would be a betrayal of the respect I had just earned back, not just from the world, but from myself. My refusal was not an act of punishment against her. It was an act of preservation for me. I could not go back to being a ghost. I would rather be a man with a cot in a shelter than a ghost in a comfortable home. My slow, contemplative walk through the shelter had not gone unnoticed. Later that afternoon, as I was helping Anna fold a set of donated blankets, the shelter's director, a kind but perpetually exhausted-looking woman, approached me. She stood for a moment, watching me work, and then gave me a small, respectful nod. She gestured toward the chaotic community board, which was now almost entirely covered with new offers of help and support. She pointed to a freshly pinned notice from a local community college, an advertisement for part-time tutors for adult education classes. She then tapped the section that listed science and earth studies. It was a simple, silent gesture, but its meaning was clear. The world was beginning to present new possibilities. The elixir was not just a resolution to the past, it was an opening to the future. That night, as I lay on my cot, the familiar symphony of coughs and murmurs around me, I felt a sense of peace I had not known in years. The future was a great, uncharted map, a vast expanse of unknown weather patterns. It was a frightening prospect, but it was not a hopeless one. I took out my logbook. In the dim light of the shelter, I did not record barometric pressure or wind speed. I simply wrote the date. It was the first entry in a new chapter, the first day of a new, uncertain, but finally honest forecast. The resolution began not with a phone call or a sudden visit, but with a piece of paper. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope, incongruously formal amidst the functional chaos of the shelter's front desk. Anna brought it to me, her eyes wide with a kind of reverent excitement. My name was on the front, printed in a clean, authoritative font, Professor Samuel Miller. The use of my old title, a name I had not been called in years, was a small, quiet shock. The return address was the Department of Earth Sciences at the local university, a place I had once considered a second home. The letter inside was concise and formal. It spoke of my demonstrated expertise in the recent news story and invited me to campus to discuss a potential consulting role. It was not an offer of charity. It was a professional summons. The journey to the university was a journey across worlds. I left the shelter on a bright, cool morning, the city washed clean by the thaw. I took a city bus, the fare paid with a token given to me by Anna. As the bus rumbled through the city's arteries, I watched the landscape transform. We passed through the gritty industrial neighborhoods that surrounded the shelter, and then into the bustling commercial downtown, and finally into the quiet, leafy streets that bordered the university campus. It felt like traveling backward in time, returning to a life I thought was lost forever. When I stepped off the bus and onto the familiar red brick pathways of the campus, I felt a sense of belonging so profound, it almost buckled my knees. The air here smelled different, a mixture of old books, damp ivy, and the fresh-cut grass of the main quad. The energy was one of youthful purpose, of students hurrying to class, their minds full of equations and theories. This was my natural habitat. The dean of the Earth Sciences Department was a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a firm, welcoming handshake. She led me not to a grand office for an interview, but on a quiet tour of the department, a conversation between peers conducted almost entirely without words. She showed me the new atmospheric modeling computers, their screens a swirl of complex, colorful data. I watched them for a moment, then pointed to a small, almost imperceptible anomaly in a pressure trough forming over the Pacific, a detail the computer model had likely missed, but that my trained eye caught instantly. A flicker of deep, professional respect passed through her eyes. She showed me a lecture hall, the tiered seats empty now, and I could almost feel the familiar weight of a piece of chalk in my hand, the quiet satisfaction of explaining a complex system to a room of eager minds. The tour was not a test. It was a reacquaintance, a welcoming home. The offer, when it came, was as direct and as dignified as the woman who made it. Back in her office, she slid a single sheet of paper across her polished desk. It was a formal contract. I read the words, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. Consulting meteorologist, guest lecturer on observational forecasting. And then, the final, most important line. A small one-bedroom faculty apartment to be made available immediately. I read the sentence again, the words blurring slightly. A home. Not a room in someone else's house, not a temporary cot, but a home. My home. The resolution to my long personal winter was here, printed in black ink on a piece of paper. I looked up from the contract and met the dean's steady, respectful gaze. I gave a single firm nod of acceptance. A warm, genuine smile spread across her face, and she pushed a small single key across the desk towards me. The apartment was in a quiet, older building on the edge of campus, reserved for visiting professors and staff. It was small, simple, and filled with the quiet, dusty light of late afternoon. It had a main room with a large window overlooking the campus green, a small functional kitchen, and a bedroom. It was perfect. The silence was the most luxurious thing I had experienced in what felt like a lifetime. It was a clean, academic silence, punctuated only by the distant chime of the library clock tower. For a long moment, I simply stood in the center of the empty room, feeling the profound, unbelievable reality of having a space that was entirely my own. My first act of possession was a quiet ritual. I placed my old duffel bag on the clean, polished hardwood floor. I unzipped it and took out the few items that constituted the entirety of my worldly possessions. I placed my leather-bound logbook on the center of a built-in wooden desk that sat beneath the window. Next to it, I placed my pocket barometer, its brass casing catching the afternoon light. These two small objects, my tools and my history, instantly transformed the empty apartment into my study. I had claimed the space. I was no longer homeless. I walked to the large window and looked out. I saw students crossing the green, their heads bent in conversation. I saw the vast, open sky, a canvas of endless fascination. I thought of the shelter, now bustling with the resources and goodwill my story had generated. My brief, painful passage through that world had left it, I hoped, a little better than I had found it. I thought of Claire, a distant, sorrowful ache in my chest. The path to this room, to this new life, had not led through her. I had found my own way back, on my own terms. My resolution was my own. I turned from the window, pulled the desk chair out, and sat. I opened my logbook to a fresh, clean page. The future was no longer a question of survival, but one of work, of purpose, of observation. The forecast was, at long last, clear. Several months had passed, and the world had settled into a new, quiet rhythm. My apartment, which had at first felt like a vast, empty cavern, had slowly become a home, a true sanctuary built not on the sufferance of others, but on my own reclaimed dignity. The once bare walls were now covered with my hand-drawn meteorological charts, a colorful, swirling tapestry of past and present weather systems. The bookshelves, which I had painstakingly filled from second-hand university bookshops, were overflowing with the familiar spines of my old, beloved textbooks. My brass barometer, polished to a high sheen, sat in a place of honor on my desk, its needle a silent, faithful companion. Life had found its pattern, a gentle, predictable cycle of study, observation, and work. Each morning, I would analyze the satellite data on the new laptop the university had provided, but I would always compare it to the readings from my own instruments, the tangible physical truths of the air around me. This fusion of the new and the old was the essence of my new life. I had not been replaced. I had adapted. The late afternoon was my favorite time of day. The sun would slant through the large window of my study, its golden light illuminating the dust motes dancing in the still air and casting long, peaceful shadows across the room. I was at my desk, preparing my forecast for the local evening news, a task that brought me a quiet and profound sense of purpose. I was no longer a forgotten relic. I was a contributing member of a community, my knowledge a small but valued commodity. I was charting a developing low-pressure system over the plains, my pencil tracing the familiar, elegant curve of an isobar, completely absorbed in the beautiful, logical language of the sky. It was in this moment of perfect academic peace that the knock came. It was not a loud or demanding knock. It was a soft, hesitant tapping, a sound so uncertain that at first I thought it might be a branch brushing against the door in the breeze. But it came again, a little more insistent, yet still profoundly tentative. It was not the confident rap of a colleague or a student. It was the sound of a question, not an announcement. A deep, quiet stillness settled over me. I set my pencil down. I knew, with the same intuitive certainty that allowed me to feel a coming change in the weather, who was on the other side of that door. I rose slowly from my chair, my joints creaking a quiet protest, and walked to the door. I did not look through the peephole immediately. I simply stood before the solid oak, a final barrier between my new, carefully constructed peace and the chaotic, emotional weather of my past. Finally, I raised myself to the small glass lens. There she was. It was Claire, but not the Claire I had seen in a long time. She was not the cold, efficient executive who had sentenced me to exile, nor was she the frantic, humiliated woman who had fled from the shelter. The woman standing in the hallway looked smaller. Her expensive coat was gone, replaced by a simple jacket. Her hair was pulled back without any particular style. She was not looking at my door, but down at her own hands, which were nervously clutching a round glass baking dish. Steam was rising from it, fogging the cool air of the hallway. It was a pie. A homemade apple pie, I could tell from the latticed crust, the kind Sarah used to make. She was shifting her weight from foot to foot, a portrait of pure, unadulterated uncertainty. I took a deep breath and opened the door. We stood on either side of the threshold, the space between us a silent, charged territory. Her eyes, when she finally raised them to meet mine, were filled with a galaxy of complicated emotions. There was a deep, residual shame there, but also a flicker of something fragile and desperate that looked almost like hope. She did not speak. She did not offer a practiced apology or a string of excuses. She simply held the pie out in front of her, the gesture a humble, unspoken offering. It was not a gift meant to buy her way back into my life. It was a penitence offering, an admission of a wrong so profound that words were insufficient. I looked at her, at the daughter who had broken my heart, and I felt the last bitter dregs of my anger finally dissolve, leaving only a vast, deep ocean of sorrow. I saw the little girl I had taught to read the clouds, and the stranger who had left me in a storm, and I understood that they were, somehow, the same person. My victory had not been in shaming her. The world had done that for me. My true and final test was here, on this threshold. The power to define the future of our broken family was now entirely mine. I could have closed the door. I could have refused her offering. But as I looked at the pie, a simple, warm, and honest thing, I knew that I would not. After a long moment that seemed to stretch into a lifetime, I slowly, deliberately, reached out both of my hands and accepted the baking dish from her. It was warm to the touch. Our fingers brushed for a fleeting second, a small spark of human connection in the quiet hallway. I held the pie. I did not step back to invite her in. I did not step forward to close the door. I simply stood there, in my own home, holding her apology in my hands, the future of our relationship an uncertain forecast, waiting for me, and me alone, to decide on the new season.